All right, so I'm Tiffany Funk. I'm a PhD in art history as well as an MFA in media. And
I'm Chaz Evans. I'm also an MFA in the New Media Arts program.
And we are presenting a sort of bifurcated project, which will basically end up being probably two projects that are very much together. And we have some general questions that we want to start out with as we proceed with this presentation. The questions that we'd like to explore for a general sort of more longer history of human augmentics is what is human augmentics before it was named as such?
Maybe just start by saying this is more a history, theory, and criticism-oriented project than it is the development of technology, just so there aren't any sort of surprises later in the presentation.
Right, exactly. And if human augmentics constitutes the non-biological evolution of humans, what fits under the rubric of the non-biological, which is a huge problem, which is something that I'm exploring in my PhD research. If systems of writing, mathematics, etc., if these all fit into the realm of human augmentics, stretching back into antiquity, how can we understand pre-modern ancient concepts that use these tools to determine the outcome of future events, i.e., using tools to cultivate a sixth sense, prognostication, devices, and systems? What is the relationship between magic and science? What is the mathematical software component to prognostication? And does software fit into a divination paradigm? So the hypothesis that we're working with generally is cross-cultural prognostication systems from the ancient past to the present adhere to increasingly complex algorithmic patterns outlining the repetition of simple binaries that lead to divinations that are commonly wrongly referred to as magically or randomly produced. These systems are mimicked by contemporary software's ability to perform numerically generative functions, also wrongly called random in colloquial jargon. Before our modern conception of human augmentics became a largely digital mechanical intervention in the biological, the ancients' divination methods constituted a dominant form of extending and enhancing that which was considered the human experience. And by calling upon the word random here, as we know, like in coding, random is rarely random. It's a programmed specific device for generating, which can be seen in almost any sort of software, from like first-person shooters and those sort of video games. So to go back to ancient history very quickly, so to speak a little bit more about what prognostication actually is, this here is an example of ectopsy, which is the entrail reading. So here you can see the cuneiform script on here, Etruscan inscriptions. So despite the strange imagery that we have in modern conceptions of this sort of practice, the idea was largely scientific at the time, and it might be thought of as an early mode of autopsy and made use of inductive reasoning through its findings. So, droughts leading to different things would lead to different types of eating habits for animals. You cut them open, you could find these sort of things, and you could inductively reason what was going to happen next in your region, say. Another type of prognostication element, which I think is particularly interesting for these projects, is augury, which is the reading of the flight patterns of birds. Because augury really becomes a generation of a binary system to create more complex algorithmic systems. So a stream of questions would be asked, like how many birds, where are they flying, what direction, et cetera, until you had a very complex sort of algorithmic system that you're bringing together in order to prognosticate, for example.
Is that a real liver?
No, it's actually like a pattern for how to read. It's like when you were it was the answer key.
The liver legend.
Because at this time there were like complex schools of how to do this. So it's like, if you're going to be a doctor, if you're going to be a divination expert or an augur, as they're called, then you carry around one of these and say, oh, you put that there and you put the liver next to it and you'd be like, oh, yeah.
Just wait. Don't jump on Matt.
So to jump forward to some of the theoretical background that we are looking at, that actually Chaz and I are both very interested in, is somebody like Friedrich Hitler, for example, who just recently passed away. He's a meteor theorist and programmer who sought to reconcile pre-modern modes of production and contemporary media usage. His text on discourse networks, particularly, makes the case that kinds of technology we use fundamentally influence how we behave and what we produce. In this way, prognostication techniques fundamentally influenced personal and societal actions at the time. So biological models, those using natural forms such as animal innards and regional fauna, would receive different results than the increasingly recursive models derived by later civilizations, namely the increasingly mathematically generated systems of like some of the African tribes that we'll be speaking about in a moment, and specifically the I Ching. So this actually, some of his theories will provide a smooth progression between the more biological models of prognostication and cybernetic systems, specifically things, the digital revolution and everything that took off after World War II. The next, there are many theorists, of course, that we're going to be using, but these are the most influential ones as of right now. Ron Eglash, who Chaz turned me on to, who has a fantastic TED Talk, by the way. He's an ethnomathematician, and he's the author of the book African Fractals, and it's a book that examines the fractal patterns underpinning architecture, art, and design in many parts of Africa. So by looking at a lot of these aerial view photos of these tribal and cities in these areas, and then following up with detailed research on the ground, Eglash discovered that many of these African villages are purposely laid out to form these perfect fractals with self-similar shapes repeating in rooms of the house, and down to even things like hairstyles and patterns like that. And so through doing this, they could actually prognosticate, because these systems would repeat themselves ad infinitum. So onto this project, which is more Chaz.
Just to explain this particular example of the I Ching and how it works not only as a divination system, but possibly as an early precursor for augmented technology. I don't know if anyone's actually read the I Ching or is interested in it, but you throw 3 coins 6 times. It starts as just a system of binary pairs, and through sort of several phases of sort of generating those binary pairs into more growth and complexity, you end up at 1 out of 64 hexagrams, which all have a certain proverb or piece of divination attached to them. So it's a particularly interesting example because as like a cultural object, it cannot be exhausted. Its meaning can't be exhausted by describing it as either just a numerical system or just a religion or a matter of spirituality. It is the generation of numbers through the system of representation that makes it meaningful, so that's what you get. Is sort of the combination of software, this numerical system, and sort of the activities that go along with it, coins and a book, which could possibly be considered hardware, and that all sort of working together in performance. That sort of like, it gives you this sort of extra sense, this sort of this access into the divine, and this is, or something better put, outside of our typical limits and senses. So that's just why we think of it as an interesting precursor in this history of human augmentics we're trying to elucidate. And this is just a particular example of how I'm trying to illustrate some of my current work as an artist, where I've taken the I Ching and tried to put it in the role of media production and consumption.
So for the next iteration of that project, which we would build for this class, it would be more of in an app form, the Hold Your Horses app. So these are some of the things that we'd like to explore in this. Of course, this is just kind of a brainstorming as of right now, but we do want it to be something that could be used in this course by the different groups.
It could be given to everyone in the course exclusively for free. download it off the Android
Aren't we
market
generous?
or something like that. This is sort of the idea. Is that this is somewhat inspired by the earlier presentation on persuasive visualizations. It's like, what would be the ultimate persuasive visualization? The one that persuaded you to just be self-reflexive and critical. So that and that could function very similar to one of these numerical divination systems that we were just talking about. So this is one of the ideas of part of this proposal is approaching these questions with a piece of software that could be mobile and sort of attached to your personal day-to-day.
Right, and the app itself would be a very recursive and self-reflexive app because the open source code that we use for it would do these numerically generative steps to achieve these divination readings. So it would be very open to the fact that it is all software driven, but it will form that sort of procedural element that something like the I Ching has, for example. So in this way, the code will explore these historical layers that I was just speaking about and result in some sort of prognosticatory image and message. Of course, the image is to be determined, but
text.
It could be just text. It could be an actual, really complex image.
Right.
So,
That's one
but
idea.
it will stand for the algorithm that's used to generate it, basically. So again, it will be recursive sort of thing. So the code will attempt to lay bare the nature of randomness in both divination systems and software, situating them in a shared historical trajectory. And then finally, the final project in practice will form a historical narrative that stretches from early prognostication systems to emerging into disciplines like human augmentics and allows for this sort of critical reflection.
So that's sort of like the long-term view. And I guess we should put a caveat. We're still sort of garnering ideas, and I know the presentation is already pretty wide. So with this feedback, maybe we can get afterwards to sort of narrow it down. But so that's the long term, and this is the short term history. So that these two sort of lengths of history. This one would be this part of the proposal is to take that very long history and narrow it down so that it would be applicable and meaningful to the projects in this class specifically. But for that to maybe be useful as sort of a class community, we wanted to establish these simple premises as to what you do with a historical, critical, and theoretical context like the one that we are proposing. And quite simply, if you have these kinds of narratives and references that you can learn how better to communicate across disciplines about the importance of augmented technology, your position sort of politically and culturally as a producer or developer of augmented technology, and you can also more meaningfully engage in discourse with people who are on the other side of the cultural tracks, so to speak, in a meaningful way, rather than sort of turning everyone off to the development of technology, or perhaps just sort of the willful ignorance of the development of technology. To further explain that, what are the reasons that would be valuable to both the technology or culture at large? To sort of break away from sort of willful ignorance, of people say, well, I'm just not a scientist, or I'm not a technologist. Why should I care? When you sort of turn out, when you are able to have these conversations, the very particular mechanisms of technology turn out to be interesting to people, and those sort of can diversify knowledge outside of scientists, out of the black boxes, they say. And also we can avoid knee-jerk conclusions about sort of how people feel about technology that's being developed. You see a lot of sensationalist media about new technologies being made, and usually people will immediately jump to a judgment as to whether or not this is good or bad for society, when unchecked utopianism and dystopianism are usually both naive and uninformed positions. So if you are able to have a conversation, you may be able to make a more nuanced position outside of these sort of completely terminal conclusions. But more practically, if you're able to have conversations outside of your disciplinary lane, you can actually get practical information which can improve your project on a functional and cultural level. Both actually make the thing work better and also make it more palatable or integrated into society as a whole.
And as a quick note about the black box, that's where I personally think that the magic and science actually share a sort of common ground, where if you have software and if you have technology that is black box, people are so much more likely to just say,
To fear it.
To fear it, don't know how it works, or just ignore it in general, just thinking that, you know, there's a sort of magic that goes on inside it, and you just press a button and it does something.
Right. So that's sort of explanation as to why we're up here talking about this. And so how could those things more practically take shape? We have this idea of also writing short addendums, which could be a part of each project in this class, that include three things, basically. A brief historical narrative to situate each technology in, sort of a list or a cataloging of cultural references that made the idea for your projects possible, because every single project in the class thus far has a lot of precedent in cultural references as film, television, literature, video games, etc. And then like a bibliography as to what theorists, critics, and thinkers are highly relevant to that project, so that you can have that common ground with people outside of the development of the project. Yes?
Regarding your second question, what specific cultural references, are you, like, I guess I'm a little confused. Are you saying that the culture came first and then not culture, I'm talking about the cultural references in this film and TV. Are you saying that came first, or are you just trying to find connections?
I would actually, there's a designer named Julian Bleecker, and he has this term diegetic prototypes. He uses briefly, his best example is that when Kubrick was making 2001, he was just trying to figure out how a spaceship should look. And then he got people from NASA to help him figure out how a spaceship should look. And in doing so, actually solved real problems of how to make space travel work. So that's a very strong example about how science fiction or other sorts of technology in other places of cultural production actually precede or is the thing that makes the technologist actually take the step to make the actual real thing. And those are cultural narratives that do precede up to the point of actually working on a thing.
Okay, so is your position is this sometimes happens, this always happens?
I mean, it's up for debate. My opinion is it typically comes out of sort of a slipstream of cultural ideas before it ever makes it to the laboratory.
Right. So when you say cultural ideas, however, are you talking about just general, thinking, philosophy, or are you talking reference to specific media products? Because culture is bigger than media.
Yeah.
So that's...
But it's very fun to find examples from specific texts in artistic media. But absolutely that comes out of any sort of creative production in the humanities or anything else. But the ones that sort of land, especially science fiction texts, like they have an indelible impact in the development of technology. That's sort of more personal bias,
right.
I guess.
Well, and we're both coming from this sort of background of thinking, for example, like the photograph, the technology for the photograph existed 200 years before the photograph was actually invented. But it only came to be because of the certain cultural and social and economic circumstances that led Niepce to do what he did.
Well, yeah, and so you said cultural, social, and economic. That's what I'm getting at.
Yes, we're not just talking about just science fiction films or things, but those also come from those social and economic, backgrounds as well. So it's all fomented by all these things.
I would say, like, for this type of writing, referring to texts such as those are especially useful for this kind of format. But of course, there would be no reason to say it can only be those.
Right, and they just serve as just really great, like, visual examples too, like touchstones. Like specifically, the Star Trek communicator and then the cell phone.
Right. So that's our sort of two-part project, and I guess maybe feedback the most useful is how to make it feasible as far as time and the end of the semester and other questions or challenges.
So the thing that interests me is in human augmentics, we're sort of walking ahead, and we don't know necessarily how the future of this technology is going to develop. And yet, in history, this occurs over and over and over again. So having a glimpse back to how other societies or other times within human history where this kind of technology boom happened, and even if it's just going from making spears to making arrows or something, how did that progress and how did that affect society? In other words, how did society accept it? Because I remember as a kid when computers started to come into industry and they started to take jobs away, then people went berserko saying, you know, we're all going to be robots and robots going to run the world. And we can't wait. And they are now. So, I mean, getting a look back can also sometimes help us understand what may happen and what we might do about it.
So like predict an audience reaction to the things we're making today.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that could be hinted at. You don't want to like make too many sweeping predictions, because that kind of sci-fi is a little like the kind of like that's something we definitely want to avoid, is to sort of foreclose on the definite result of any of these projects. You know, that like it's definitely going to ruin society or it's definitely going to save us all. That's the temptation of any of these sort of critical projects. So that wouldn't be the kind of thing said, but you could a more subtle thing to be gleaned about sort of the reception of society of technology.
So one of the things, just in your presentation, and I don't know if this is something you're really trying to get at, but these earlier sort of prognostication systems, of augury or divination or astrology or whatever, are all based on, or seem to be oriented towards gathering information that is manageable by the human mind so that a decision can be made to make some sort of change. And these are largely like pull sorts of things. Like you have to go get, you have to read the stars, you have to kill the sheep, you have to like actually get this information and then use that, you know, as like a distilled form of complexity to make a decision about what's going to happen. But the things that we're doing in human augmentics, particularly in this class, seem mostly to be automating this pull of information to such a rapid and granular degree that it becomes a push. And there's no longer a decision to say, I'm going to try to get some information and interpret it myself to make a decision, but I'm going to algorithmically automate that so that the interpretation of the decision is already made, and I'm being acted upon deliberately to affect my own behavior.
I think that's a much point.
The app that you're sort of describing here uses this kind of stochastic simulation to generate randomness that can be interpreted, but it's sort of, I mean, I guess it seems like as much as you can apply Newtonian mechanics to behavior, like, I mean, you can't push on yourself to move yourself across the room. You know, I mean, like, if you just sit here and try to affect your own behavior, you're not going to actually go anywhere. All you might do is kind of justify what you already want to do. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how you're actually going to trigger a moment of self-reflection and criticality in a way that's going to allow enhanced decision-making or change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the goal here is to open up that moment of self-reflexivity, possibly through a sort of a creative or rhetorical means, like with it's sort of a satirical app, but also through discourse itself. Just by saying, hey, let's just talk about this for a second.
In a two-pronged approach to the question, the prognostication systems that I was talking about started out fairly simply, but took on a complexity that automated itself. I mean, even the efficacy, you know, like reading entrails, there was a certain amount that you would just, you know, A plus B equals C, and you wouldn't really think of the sort of beginning reasonings that went behind it, or the beginning reasonings for why you come to this conclusion if birds are flying south. So this increasing automation would create these more and more complex systems that predate software, but software does that as well. It's the automation of these sort of these small tasks that just complexify themselves. And so the app itself would have this sort of component in it, and what I was like hoping, and Chaz I'm sure too, was hoping that by making it this open source thing and being able to read the actual system, like the code itself, you could read that into it, like all the small things that were happening that were automated, but that we physically coded into the system, if that makes sense.
Like perhaps the reason that we can't have that moment of interpretation or agency in one of these heightened automated systems is because the information is trapped inside of some sort of black box where there's no access to it. Maybe that's why the I Ching is, I like your comment on because it sort of strengthens the I Ching as this historical example to look to while we make these new things. So make sure we implant that part of it into the process.
So I guess I probably could have asked the question much more concisely, but like, where are you introducing new information in your app? I mean, like, where are you actually taking an external sort of force and applying it, allowing it to be applied to the person that's using the app, such that they're not just internally like trying to examine themselves, which isn't necessarily like a futile exercise, but
right.
So you mean how to be sort of pushing the
how do you make the app be like really specifically meaningful to the individual endeavors that person's doing that day? Yeah, I mean, at this point, it was, like I said, it was sort of like a satire. So and the specific information was like going to come out in the writing projects, but it'd be that is the golden question. How do you make them the same thing?
There's a part of it that I was also wondering too is like if future versions of this app have more of a component where it takes metrics of you as you go into it, or you have to answer many questions, and then it seems even more specific to yourself. It would be the same thing as going to a fortune teller who looks at you and reads you, and then pulls out the hangman card.
Yes.
So you named 2 scholars in your presentation. Are you drawing on any other sources from philosophy?
Many.
Okay.
There would be a bucket load.
Yeah, I mean it's everywhere from Bergson to Adorno to
Barthes.
Like a lot of these already have these sort of
particularly
critiques.
Philosophy of technology.
Sure,
Yes.
you want Carolyn Marvin, you want Donna Haraway, you want
And Catherine
Hales.
I'm further.
Sherry Turkle.
I'm more
Or even further back, like Heidegger.
Illich.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well,
Illich,
Heidegger and like his history of
Hegel.
technology and such. There's quite a few.
No.
You guys were talking about, back to the app, about this sort of laying bare the mechanism of the I Ching or whatever the thing becomes. And at the moment that it's also a satirical thing, I wonder if it's not enough for it to be like an open source thing that somebody who is software literate can go in and understand, but are you suggesting that is the sort of output is you entered, you like blue, so you like blue means you like the sky, means you want to learn how to fly, means you should take a plane. You know what I mean? Like that kind of satirical nature is going to be divulged by the app. I mean, I'm trying to understand how this laying bare actually happens in the app.
I think a lot of that's to be determined because we
Yeah.
haven't really talked too much about the messages that would come out of it yet.
The sort of thing is you already have this thing which is perhaps persuading you or not, but you don't know what sort of critical accuracy. You have this like moment over here saying, "Really, dude?" Like think about that for a second. Would be press, and that's sort of like why we're sort of drawing upon the divination system, because all that kind of divination is written in sort of inarguable language. Like you can't disagree with the divination. The point is sort of to open up a moment of contemplation. So that's sort of that was our initial idea of how this could function. Is these kind of ambiguous phrases, but you sort of then find out how you were supposed to act by your interpretation of it. It's like how do you argue with the horoscope, but then you sort of run with it however you sort of start to interpret it.
Are these phrases though like referencing your what you're referencing in the slideshow, or are they like what are they referencing?
Phrases?
Yeah, the phrases.
What we'll figure out.
They are TBD.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like what that will do for someone, except for laugh or something.
Yeah, well, that's something that
Laughing could be a very
really-
important moment.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's the
Or
sort of
it's
thing
just
that
a
we're going to have to try out. I mean, it's a sort of, it's going to be experimentation, definitely. But
So I don't know about everything you've said to be able to make any kind of informed opinion, but when I was listening to you, one thing I had noticed, and I could be wrong, was that one of the main sort of tenets of human augmentics that we believe really makes sort of human augmentation stands out, and it's really what we think will sort of change the way we thought about human augmentation in the past, is the notion that we now today are collecting data at an exponential rate. And in fact, that is now really having major ramifications in the way we sort of traditionally think about how science is done. It's shaking the foundation of science so much that some scientists are up in arms in this, because the traditional methodology for science is that you come up with a model, you come up with a hypothesis about how the world should work, and then you go out and you look for the data to prove that your model is correct. The new model today that's emerging because of the fact that we're collecting all this data, well, this is something that basically Google is saying to us all, is that to hell with the model, because there is no way we can potentially even begin to conceptualize a model that works, because the world is too complex to come up with that unifying field theory of godness, right? But instead, we have all this data. If we can take all this data and we can use sort of statistical methods, we can actually make pretty darn good predictions about what will happen next. And so scientists are somewhat up in arms in this, because on the one hand, yes, it makes very good predictions, but on the other hand, we don't understand why it makes good. Yeah. So I would be very interested in sort of seeing from your historical perspective how you think in an age of exponential data, how that affects divination or prognostication and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that that's a point where we lean heavily on cybernetic theory, and specifically, and Catherine Hales, and then going back to sort of the sins of the forefathers, like Norbert Wiener, like these whole ideas of when you get trapped in this cycle, and it's like creating the data and then using it again and again, and how that sort of launches you in a certain direction without any criticality.
But the point is that we're not creating the data. This is what's really important when you have to sort of distinguish. These algorithms are, in your previous example, have been creating data, and as a result there's a feedback loop where any error that's introduced will continue to just be in the system. But the new model we're talking about is that the data it's not created, it's actually collected and observed at a precision that was never before accomplishable. For example, historically, the way we collect data has been perhaps somewhat fuzzy. Sam said, "Oh, I saw a sparrow jump on top of this, therefore it must be true that all sparrows do this," right? Now, because we have sensor networks that track all this, we can actually observe on a sample of billions that this phenomena is true or not.
So that notion can be challenged, though. Like, you could construe that the collection or this observation isn't impartial, but is creating this data, even if it's much larger, and much more complex, or much faster, because numbers didn't exist in nature to begin with. So there's still sort of a moment of conversion.
It's a different way of defining creation.
And
all
these systems that we've created to create the data have been created in our own
So you're saying
image.
artifacts could be, well, absolutely, that's true. That's absolutely true. Artifacts can be introduced in the data collection process, which may lead you down to a conclusion that really didn't exist. Let's say, like the Hubble telescope, when they first got it up there was a flaw in the lens, and you see some image that said, hey, that's a new planet. Well, no, it wasn't. It was a defect in the lens. Right. So that point is.
But I think both perspectives should be accounted for.
Exactly.
Good point.
I think that's why the prognostication idea is so interesting, because since you say that the data just exists, well, it's just based on the questions you're asking. So it comes down to what questions are you asking. This is this is collection and creation happening simultaneously.
Yep.
I think that another important distinction is not just the presence of feedback, but what type of feedback you have. Because if you have only positive feedback, then as Jason says, any error that you introduce at the beginning is going to persist, and for the most part, it's going to explode and dominate the system. What's new in the last several hundred years with science, and even more today with automated science techniques, is the negative feedback, which is testing that things aren't true so that you can discard the errors and refine the model quicker.
And even aside from that, the questions that you're asking are just as important as the questions that you aren't asking, because there's this huge blank space that just is unexplored.
So what do you hope to have by the end of the semester?
I mean,
we won't find, or it's...
No, I mean, we probably just presented some ideas, probably more than we could maybe accomplish in a semester. So at this point, yeah, also some guidance about what would be most useful to the rest of the course, what would be most useful to the discipline, or most desirable would be good for us, so then we could sort of narrow it down.
And first and foremost, I think the addendums would be very important to at least come up with a sort of literature review, or a way in which to add something to the projects that are already being done in the course, because that's a strength that we give.
So are you going to use historical information to predict? Because predictions are very scary, and they're usually wrong.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of saying earlier about not making a prophecy, or foreclose on and say, like, this is how it's going to turn out. I'd say rather than a prediction, like maybe the word we're working with is divination, where it involves this moment of interpretation on the part of the user.
Exactly. Because it doesn't exist outside of the sort of contemplation of the user. I mean, if you read a horoscope, it's only as much as you put into it.
Mm-hmm. A metaphorical way of trying to get us the sort of forward-thinking information we can have, but have that still not be one of these highly determinate conclusions.
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, even a tall dark stranger could be Chaz if you really wanted it.
Here I am. I've come. Any other feedback, or just any other, I don't know, immediate reactions about what the people would like to see more?
Yeah, that's
a deliverable.
I think the addendum idea is very interesting and could be immediately applicable to probably everybody. I guess the question I would have is how do you see that? I mean, you see that sort of tailored to this course based on these projects, or how do you sort of set the parameters for this aside from this kind of historical overview?
One thing that we talked about was the fact that a lot of the projects in the course are not dislike other projects that are being done anywhere. Of course, we're going to make it specific to these projects, but then explore how these same methods, for example, can be thought of in certain ways in the historical and cultural theoretical critique. Yeah.
So you do have two separate projects here. The divination idea is kind of interesting. My concern with that is that it's I don't know how I would make. I don't know how I would realize it by the end of the semester. Other than the Magic 8-Ball app,
Which we could do.
which you could do. But I can certainly see the second half of what you're discussing here, rather useful, and thinking in terms of, if we were to try and continue to expand on human augmentics as a discipline for URC in the long term, having a filter for what are really the relevant ideas from other contexts would actually be helpful, because then one can use that information to form some kind of curriculum to say that out of all the body of knowledge about philosophy and art and history and so forth, these things are some of the central ideas that really allow us to think critically about human augmentics, whereas these ones probably not, and so wouldn't be quite limited. So for me, being not from this discipline, I can imagine this is very helpful. And then the other thing I recommend you do, and I think I mentioned this already, is that you should, if possible, in engaging with these other projects, actually participate in some of the experimentation.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
We really like that.
Because if you're to write about this, I think you really need to sort of get your hands dirty.
Right. We certainly don't want to be on the outside critique, like bringing it down from the bottom.
Right.
It's a very much sort of thing that we want to be
Because your
involved.
perceptions of it will be very different once you suffer.
And we're hoping so.
Yeah, that's been our sort of MO as sort of like practitioners / critical theorists and artists.
I think that that's kind of what makes us different than just
Right.
dyed-in-the-wool theorists as being artists as well.
Right, okay. Because that's always one of the criticisms scientists or engineers always have of, external criticism from other disciplines.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think
They
that's
don't do any of this stuff, how do they really
Yeah,
know?
it's completely true. I mean, I think that there's a growing sort of artistic conversation around like people like Stellar who actually do this stuff. They actually have experience and they work with scientists. It's very much part of me.
But the comment really resonates, is that the unwillingness to look at under the hood or sort of do each other's grunt work is what usually creates these sort of lines of cultural chauvinism between disciplinary lines.
Oh,
of
absolutely.
personalities.